Well, welcome everybody to today's FAFSA Fridays. This is a third in a series of 4 sessions that we're doing specifically about the FAFSA and changes related to that. We are recording this session so that it will be available on our website next week. I will also follow up with an email to all of you and everyone who registered so that you will be able to review any of this if that's something that you would like to do. I do absolutely encourage questions, so go ahead and put them in the chat and I'll stop periodically and address the questions that we have or follow up in the email if needed. So here's what we're going to do today, which is a little bit different than I might have thought the other day. First, we're going to cover some of the topics discussed in previous FAFSA Fridays. We're not going to talk about them in detail, but I just want you to know what we've already covered in the first 2 sessions. Then we're going to share some recent updates from federal student aid. They had a big announcement out the other day, and so I want to tell you about that. Next, we'll recap what's going to happen this fall. Now, or what needs to happen this fall, ideally. Those of you who have been with us for several different types of our presentations, you're going to find a little bit of this is repetitive, but that's actually intentional because there are so many changes, but there are some that we think are really critical to ensure that students and parents are ready for the fall. And so there's some things that we really want you to know. And so we're going to talk about those. Then we're going to do some new content. We're going to talk about FSA ID creation for parents who don't have a social security number, because in the past they could not create an FSA ID, but now they can. After that, we're going to do a quick game of Kahoot for those of you who have done it previously, and hopefully something you enjoy. And those of you who haven't, I think you will enjoy it, I hope. It's a good way, I think, to reinforce stuff, but also have a little bit of fun. It is Friday afternoon after all. And then lastly, we're going to review some of the FAFSA process and formula changes if we have time. We've talked about them a little bit already at some of our Wednesday webinar and summer training sessions. I do want to go into a little bit more detail, but if we don't have time today, I'm going to go ahead and add them to next month because we will be doing our 4th series in December on December 15th. So I'll just add them to that content if we don't get that done today. I will end promptly at 2, actually probably about a minute before, because there is a webinar today on the FAFSA that NCAN is doing, and federal student aid is going to be there. So I want to make sure I hear whatever it is they're sharing today. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So here's what we talked about in our prior sessions. So in September, we talked about some of the new terminology. We talked about this concept of the FAFSA being roles-based, parent section and student section. We highlighted some of the FSA ID changes, not what we're going to talk about today, but some of the other changes like timing, more specifically than anything. We've talked about consent and approval and how that's all related to tax information and the direct data exchange. And we kind of summarized what we thought ideally would happen this fall to get students and parents ready. So that's what we did in September. In October, we started with a recap of what we had talked about in September. Again, those really important points we wanted to highlight. But then we focused on Pell Grant eligibility. And one of the most exciting things about the FAFSA changes and FAFSA simplification is that Pell Grant eligibility has been expanded. And it's really easy now to determine if a student is eligible for a Pell Grant before a student even files a FAFSA. So if you're interested in more about that, that was in October's content. And we also talked about the pathways for students with unusual circumstances. Think about those dependency override type situations or homeless youth. So we went into more detail about that and how the process is going to work for them. So if you're interested in catching those ones, you can go to our website, baymaine.com/FAFSA simplification, where the recordings live, as well as the slide deck. So I just wanted you to know that's what we've talked about already. The content's there if you want to listen to it. And then we'll move on today and we'll talk about some new things. So I want to start by talking about this release that came out the other day from federal student aid. It was interesting, and some of it was expected and some of it was not. I have framed it in the way they described it, which is all very positive. Okay, so it won't be available until this date, but instead this is when things are going to happen. So students and families will be able to complete and submit the FAFSA form online by December 31st. So all along, they've been saying that the FAFSA would be available sometime in December. That's basically what this is saying. Of course, given that we're into late November now almost, I think most of us think it is going to be right at the very end of the month. But it's still on track for December. So that's good. What they also announced, which was not expected, at least by me and my senses from others as well, is that schools will begin receiving information, including the ISERs, the Institutional Student Information Records. Basically, think of that as just all the FAFSA data, but that's what schools call it. It's called an ISER record. And so schools aren't going to get those ISER records or any FAFSA data for their students until the end of January. So that was surprising. Additionally, those who want to file a paper FAFSA, that will also be available by December 31st, but paper FAFSAs won't be processed until ISER records are processed and sent out to the schools. So, people can go ahead and start filing early, but there is going to be a delay before the schools get information and are able to do anything with that. Students will be able to make corrections and updates at the end of January. So that's the positive spin. The other way to say it is that students won't be able to go in and add additional schools, for example, if they think of a school they want to add later, until the end of January. Institutions will be able to start making corrections in the weeks following. That sounds to me, based on the way that the information was phrased, that schools won't be able to make corrections until February, probably, which means they won't be able to do things like process dependency overrides or do any sort of PJ. For a matter of fact, they're not even going to be able to know who's been selected for verification or who needs to provide additional information. They can't do any of that, of course, until they get the records, and then they've got to load the records and test the records. So this is a little concerning, but as I keep saying to myself and anyone else that I'm talking to, everyone, it's a level playing field. Everyone is in this situation together, and we will get through this. It's just everything's going to be a little bit later this year. Students will be notified of their SAI. Remember, the SAI is what's replacing the EFC. It's that student aid index. They will get that in their Pell Grant eligibility. Like if they're eligible for a Pell Grant, they'll know that. And I believe they'll know how much, although I haven't seen that confirmed yet. They'll know that when they submit their FAFSA. But the FAFSA submission summary, the FSS, which is the renamed Student Aid Report, or SAR, won't be available until February, like either really late January, early February, somewhere in that. And again, that's why I'm anxious to go to the webinar today at 2 and see if they clarify any of this anymore. So I will tell you, in our financial aid workshops that we've been doing, we talk about going and checking your FAFSA submission summary, after your FAFSA is processed, and, now realize that it's not going to be available for a little bit longer. So those are some of the things that we learned the other day that were interesting. And I do have a quick question here that I think is important to answer. Do we know if there's still a max of 10 schools that the students are able to send their FAFSA to in that first round? So good news on that one. The student can lift up to 20 schools now. So theoretically, it's not going to be a case. I think there's going to be room for all of the schools that students want to list, because I think any more than 20 is probably kind of overwhelming. So they can list up to 20. I think it's just if they, after the fact, think of a new school, that's where there's going to be a bit of a delay. But thankfully, it is 20. So that will make that part of it at least a little bit easier. Okay, so that's what we know. We will learn more. We will share more. We have not only our December FAFSA Fridays, but we are going to do both of our Wednesday webinars, both of our December Wednesday webinar and our January Wednesday webinar focused on the FAFSA. So the plan at the moment is December to do just kind of updates and summaries and any information that we have about helping people get ready to file the FAFSA and what they can do to prepare and be ready. And then in January, the intention now is to do an actual walkthrough of the FAFSA, to actually do a demo of the FAFSA screens and what this experience will be for students and parents. So more information to come on that, and registration materials will be available soon. Okay. So now let's recap a little bit about what needs to happen this fall. And for those of you who've been with us through several of these sessions, thanks for your patience. As we are repeating some information, we just think it's so important to share this that we're doing it every time. So first I want to talk about contributors. So this is a new term on the FAFSA, and a contributor is anyone who is required to provide information on the FAFSA and provide consent and approval. So consent and approval is another one of those new terms. Consent and approval is what allows the IRS to disclose federal tax information and to have the Department of Education use that federal tax information and then redisclose that tax information to the schools and other organizations. So a contributor is someone who's going to provide information on the FAFSA, and a contributor has to provide consent and approval to have their federal tax information shared by the IRS and redisclosed. In order to make this possible, those contributors have to have their own FSA ID. So they're going to have an FSA ID. Gone is the signature page. So you can't approve of this in a different way. The way you have to approve this is by getting an FSA ID or doing a paper FAFSA, which we really want to minimize. So I'm not really going to go into detail about that today, but the paper FAFSA will exist. But ideally, we want people to get their FSA IDs ahead of time, and so they'll be all ready to go. So the student is always a contributor. Okay, so that's just a given. Every single student out there is a contributor. Every single student is going to need to give consent and approval, and every single student is going to need to have their own FSA ID. But there are other possible contributors, and those include the parent, potentially the parent spouse, not always, but that's what we're going to talk about, and the student spouse potentially. So those are possible contributors. So when thinking about contributors, here's how you're going to identify who are officially contributors on the FAFSA in the case where a student is a dependent student and needs to provide parent information on the FAFSA. So if parents are married to each other, biological or adopted parents are married to each other, and they filed a joint tax return in 2022, because that's the critical tax year, that's the tax year that this FAFSA is using, information, including income for both parents, will be required, but only one parent will need an FSA ID. And the reason is because if parents file a joint tax return, one parent can grant consent to have their information shared on behalf of the other. So my husband and I are married. So if I were doing a FAFSA this year, which I actually don't have to this year, but if we were doing a FAFSA, I could be the parent on the FAFSA who has the FSA ID. Both of our income would be included, but only I would need an FSA ID because I can grant consent on behalf of him. So that's the way we understand that it's going to work for this upcoming year. Just one parent technically needing an FSA ID. Now, if parents are married but filed 2022 taxes separately, or if parents live together but aren't married, so they can't file a joint tax return, then again, information for both parents is required, and both parents will need an FSA ID. So that's something that's different than in the past. In the past, if you had parents who were married and filed separate tax returns, just one needed an FSA ID, but now both parents will. And that goes back to that consent and approval, because even if parents are married, if they file a separate tax return, one parent can't grant consent on behalf of the other. They've both got to have their own FSA IDs and go into the FAFSA and grant their own consent to have their own tax information shared. So what about situations where the parents are divorced, separated, or never married and don't live in the same household? So this one's kind of a two-step process. So the first thing we have to do is to figure out which parent is on the FAFSA at all. So the parent who provided the most financial support in the 12 months prior to the FAFSA being filed is going to be the parent on the FAFSA. So let's just say I'm the student, my parents are divorced, my mom provides 70% of my support, my dad provides 30% of my support. Because mom provides more financial support, she's going to be my parent on the FAFSA, and she'll need to get an FSA ID. My dad, his information won't be on the FAFSA at all, and he won't need to get an FSA ID or do anything related to the FAFSA. Okay, so that's part one. Part two is, now that I've identified that mom is my parent on the FAFSA, I have to say, is mom married or remarried today on the day the FAFSA is being filed? If she is, then information for the spouse will be required on the FAFSA. So the spouse's income information will be required. Again, this is not new. This is the way it's always been. But whether or not the spouse needs an FSA ID depends on whether or not they filed a joint tax return in 2022. So if the spouse, the mom on the FAFSA and her spouse filed a joint tax return, then the spouse does not need to get their own FSA ID. Their income's going to be on there, but they don't need to have their own FSA ID because mom can provide consent on behalf of both of them. However, if they weren't married in 2022, so couldn't file joint taxes, or for whatever reason didn't file joint taxes, then the spouse's information will not only be required, but the spouse will have to get their own FSA ID. All right. So what we'd like to see happen this fall, and what we've been out, pounding the pavement about at all sorts of different financial aid workshops, is that we want everyone to create an FSA ID ahead of time. That's something that we've really been encouraging all fall long, is for people to get their FSA IDs. And the reason why that's a big deal is because a change with this FAFSA season is that you cannot get an FSA ID and use it immediately. So in the past, we could do an event where if someone didn't know anything about the FAFSA, they could come, they could get their FSA ID, then they could use it immediately to file the FAFSA and submit it that same night. That is no longer going to be the case. This is now a two-step process. So they need to get their FSA ID because it has to be authenticated or verified with the Social Security Administration before they can do the FAFSA. So that is a change that we're experiencing this year. So therefore, we want people to get these all done now. They could go do it today. Hopefully most of them or lots of them have already done it. And we're recommending doing it at least a week before the FAFSA becomes available. So, sometime at the end of the rest of November, early December, that'd be great. They can cross that off their to-do list. Realistically, probably 2 to 3 days is fine, but we're saying a week just to make sure people have enough time. When individuals are ready to create an FSA ID, they're just going to go to studentaid.gov. And I recommend they bookmark that because that's where they're going to go back and file the FAFSA. So they're going to go to studentaid.gov. Every individual will need their own unique email address that can be accessed, as it must be verified. So in the past, people had to provide either an email address or a cell phone number and get those verified. Now everybody has to have a unique email address. Okay, so if families share one, then they need to create another Gmail account if both parents need an FSA ID. So there can only be one of that email address in the system. We do recommend that students don't use their high school email address. We want them to create a new email address because, as all of you probably are very well aware of, they're going to need the FAFSA for their FSA ID for years to come because they're going to file a FAFSA all of the years that they're in college. And then if they do borrow any federal student loans, they're going to need to be able to get into studentaid.gov so that they can view their loans and take any action that's required. So because their high school email address is going to go away after they graduate, we want them to create a new one and use that when they're creating their FSA ID, because that's going to be very necessary if they can't remember their username, they need to reset their password or anything like that. Okay. Ideally, we'd still like them to provide and verify a phone number as well. Again, that's not required, but we do recommend it because, again, a verified email or verified cell phone number can work in place of the username if they forget that. Plus, it's the way that if they can't remember information, it's how they can retrieve usernames and reset passwords. Okay. So Randy's asked a great question. If parents for a dependent student are both non-tax filers, are both parents contributors on the FAFSA? My tentative answer to that is yes. Yes, it is a little tentative, and I'm trying to think back. I even hesitated to answer it, but everything I have read, I'm thinking through, leads me to believe that the answer is yes. Because what I'm going to say in a little bit is that non-tax filers absolutely have to provide consent and approval. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And so I believe 98% of me that both parents are going to need an FSA ID so they can provide consent. That's a great question. I'll make sure I follow up on that, Randy, to be 100% sure. Okay, so now what about if people already have an FSA ID? Because of course, people only have one FSA ID because it's tied to their social security number. So everyone can only have one. If we have someone who, they've already filed in the past, or a parent who went to school themselves since 2015, or their students have older siblings, we want those people to log in to studentaid.gov to make sure that their username and password works, right? So just in case they can't remember their username and password, they can retrieve them, they can reset them, they can get that all done now so that when the FAFSA is ready to file, they're good to go on that front. The other thing is that you were able to, in the past, set up an FSA ID without using an email address. For a matter of fact, last year that was the case. So there are some families or individuals out there, that have an FSA ID that don't have an associated email address. Those individuals will need to add an email address to their account and have that verified before they can use their FSA ID again. So that's something that we'd like to have them done, and then to check and update any additional information under settings. So if they've had a change in address or any of the other information, we want people to go under settings and update that. So when you log into Federal Student Aid, there's a login button, and once you've logged in, there's a little caret where you can drop down and you'll see settings there. And it's really important that people keep that information up to date as they go through this process. So here's what you're going to see. If you go on the website with a desktop or laptop or whatever, you're going to see that you can create an account or log in. If you're doing it on your mobile phone, which I personally, my eyes aren't great these days, would never do a FAFSA on it, but I think you could probably get away with creating an FSA ID on a phone. You're going to click here instead, and that's how you're going to be able to create an account or log into an account. So another thing we want to talk about this fall is that importance of consent and approval, the fact that all contributors need to provide consent and approval. And if they don't, the student is ineligible for federal student aid. And that's a black and white. There's things in financial aid that are gray, and there's things that are black and white. This is a black and white one. Everybody has to provide consent and approval if they are considered a contributor. This includes non-tax filers, which is why I'm thinking if both parents are non-tax filers, they both have to provide consent and approval. It's going to include even those people who have filed taxes for that year because they got an extension. It's going to include those people who file a foreign tax return. So they're never going to have a tax return on file with the IRS. Everybody has to provide this consent and approval, because when the information is coming from the IRS, the fact that someone doesn't have a tax return on file, that is another piece of information that's important. So everybody has to provide consent and approval. If for some reason someone doesn't, because they don't realize how important this is, then what can happen is they can go back in and provide consent and approval after the fact. The good news is that it's very clear that you have to do it, and there are multiple opportunities for individuals to do that in what we've seen so far. All righty. So that's what we want to focus on this fall. Now I'd like to go into talking about FSA ID creation for parents without a social security number. I'm just watching to see if there are any more questions. There we go. We've got one. Hold on. So has FSA said anything specifically about folks who just haven't filed a tax return and haven't requested an extension? My understanding of what those individuals need to do is they all need to provide consent and approval. And what I understand happening, and I don't know quite the details or the time frame, but it will kind of circle back around and keep trying to get tax information. So the scenario I've heard described is someone provides consent and approval, and they had an extension, so they haven't filed taxes yet. And then their taxes come in a week or two later. It is going to go grab that. It's going to keep checking for that tax information. It's going to grab it and update that information in the FAFSA. Now, we won't actually see it in the FAFSA. It's going to live kind of behind the FAFSA, but it will be available to connect to the FAFSA to calculate eligibility. So that's what I understand is going to happen, but I'm also anxious to hear a little bit more about the specifics of that process. All right, well, let's go ahead and talk about FSA ID creation for parents without a social security number. Before I even start talking about this, I just want to let you know that I have listened to one webinar that was done by Federal Student Aid, and then I've listened to some follow-up podcasts with NASFA and NCAN conversations and stuff like that. So as was really with all of this, I'm sharing what I know to date, or what I've learned to date. I feel comfortable. I wouldn't share it if I didn't think it was accurate. But we are finding that every now and then things are changing too. So, and I know there are things I can't answer questions to. So I'm just going to give you today, because I thought it was important to get this information out as quickly as we could to people who might not have attended that webinar. And I will tell you where you can find that webinar at the end of this section. Okay, so when creating an FSA ID, a little bit of reiteration here, but when people create an FSA ID, they typically, till now, including still today, have to have a social security number in order to create a federal student aid account, which we refer to again as an FSA ID. That's just the username and password. Because when an FSA ID is created, the individual's name, date of birth, and social security number have to be matched with the Social Security Administration to verify an individual's identity. And you can't, if you don't have a social, there's no way to verify someone's identity through this process. So to date, anyone who hasn't had a social security number, if let's say we're talking about parents here, they have had to sign a paper signature page. With the rollout of the 24-25 FAFSA, which again, we expect, by the end of December, I'm thinking really late December, parents without an SSN are going to be able to create an FSA ID. So this is really good news. Now, before we go on though, I just want to clarify that students themselves need to be US citizens or eligible non-citizens and have a social security number in order to be eligible for federal student aid. So that's the way it's been, and that's the way it continues. So there is no change for students. There is an exception that students who are from the freely associated states like the Marshall Islands, they are eligible for federal financial aid. They meet that criteria, but they don't always have a social security number. So this process will work for them as well. But I just want to say, for the vast, unless you're working with someone from the freely associated states, students themselves have to be a US citizen or eligible non-citizen, and they have to have a social security number to be eligible for federal aid. So what I'm focused on here today is about parents. So we're really thinking about those parents who don't have a social security number, because as it's always been the case, the parent does not need to be a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen, only the student, okay? So now what we're going to talk about is what happens when a parent doesn't have a social security number because they can't do a paper signature page. How do they get an FSA ID? So the good news is it's actually really similar to how everyone else gets an FSA ID. So, it's not this whole separate process. There's a few things that are different about it that I'm going to go through, but by and large, I was just so pleased to see that they do basically the same thing. They go to studentaid.gov. They're going to click on create an account, just like everybody does. So we're going to be able to give that same information to them. Now, keep in mind, this is not ready yet. It's not going to roll out until the FAFSA rolls out. The first step will be to provide personal information, and which typically includes a social security number. But of course, if they don't have a social security number, how are they going to handle that? So what they're going to do is, with this rollout, where it asks for the social security number, there's going to be a box underneath it that says, I don't have a social security number. Now, if you go to FSA Today, or studentaid.gov, excuse me, and you try to log in, you're not going to see that checkbox. It's not going to be there until this all rolls out, when the FAFSA comes out. But there will be that new box there when this new process goes into play. Now, I know you can't see these screenshots very clearly, and I apologize for that. Federal Student Aid hasn't actually released these screenshots yet. I just did a grab of their screenshots when they did their presentation on the 2nd, because I wanted to have something to share with all of you. So I know it's not super clear. I certainly believe we will get really nice, clear, big screenshots shortly, I hope. Okay, so they will just check a box that says, I don't have a social security number. And then they're going to see a pop-up, because this pop-up is going to basically have them confirm that they are a parent or spouse of a student who is applying for aid and they don't have a social, or they're one of those, freely associated states students. They want this here because they want to be sure that only people who indicate that they don't have a social security number, and you can see how it grays out if they check that box. The only people they want to do that are people who don't have a social security number. They want to be sure that people don't check that box if they just don't want to provide one, but have one, or if they can't remember it. So they're really trying to, right out of the gate, be careful that the only people who go through this process are people that truly do not have a social security number. What the parents will do then is they will do the regular process. They will create a username and password. They, again, have to have a unique email address. So that's the case, again, with all accounts. They have to provide a mailing address. So that mailing address is really, really critical. They cannot get through this process without providing a mailing address. The mailing address is one of the pieces that are going to be used to verify their identity. So that's absolutely critical. They will be asked to provide a cell phone number. It is optional, but again, strongly recommended. It's got to be unique. It can't be one in the system already. But we really, really would love to see them do that. And then the steps that they're going to go through, like answering challenge questions, are going to be all the same as for those individuals with a social security number. So, really looks almost identical. But the difference is there's an additional step at the very end. So once people go through the process of verifying their email address and their cell phone number, if they provide it, then they are going to see this additional screen. So we basically have jumped to the end. I think it says we're on slide section 7. You can see the account's pretty much created. And so what they're going to see after that is those individuals who don't have a social security number are going to be presented with 4 questions. And these 4 questions are being referred to as knowledge-based questions. And they're very similar to, I think, what we might experience sometimes. If I go to get a copy of my tax return and I want to get a PDF of it, I have to go through this. Or sometimes with other sort of credit processes, we go through this and we basically have to say, who was our car loan through back in whenever, right? Very similar to that, although these do seem to be more basic questions. And that is because there is no credit history required for them to have this process available to these parents. So parents should still be presented with questions, even if they have no credit history. Okay, that's what we're being told. And there is no credit check. So no one needs to worry about, is someone checking my credit? What if I have a credit freeze? Any of that, none of that matters. Okay. The questions that they're being asked, because I know you can't probably read that very clearly, or I can't. So it's going to be things like previous address, previous cell phone number, previous employer. So again, there will be 4 of those. I know you're only seeing almost 3 on this screen, but there will be 4 of those. Now, here's the thing. People are only going to have one chance to answer these questions. Okay. So they're going to have to, just be really cautious as they answer those, because if they don't get them correct, we're going to talk about what happens. But it's not like the challenge questions where you get a couple of tries. And that's just because, you've got 4 options for 4 questions. And so just if you could do them repeatedly, you probably could someone even with bad intentions could get through this process. I was on a call yesterday where they are going to ask federal student aid if maybe people can have 2 chances. So maybe that will change a little bit, but certainly it's going to be limited to 1 or maybe 2, it sounds like, where things stand now. Okay, so they're going to see those 4 questions. If they answer those 4 questions correctly, they're good. Their identity will have been verified, and they will be able to use their FSA ID immediately to complete the FAFSA. Because the reason everybody else can't use their FSA ID immediately is because it has to match with the Social Security Administration. Well, they don't have a social, so there's no social to match. This is their verification process instead. So when we're doing events at, we do an ELL event at Deering and Portland high schools, those evenings, we should be able to create FSA IDs for parents who don't have socials and file the FAFSA the same night, as long as they can answer those 4 knowledge-based questions. So I think that's really good. Okay. Now, what happens if they can't? So if they cannot answer all 4 questions correctly or accurately, then they're going to see this screen. And again, these are not great screenshots, so I'm sorry about that. But what you're going to see here is it's red. and it says, call to confirm your identity. So in these cases, parents are going to need to call federal student aid and walk through a process that I'm going to share in a moment to confirm their identity. Okay, so answer them all correct, good to go. Miss any of them, then they're going to have to call federal student aid. So this is a screenshot again from that presentation that federal student aid put together. So they will have to call federal student aid. A customer service representative will look up their account and initiate the identity verification process. Okay. They will provide an email. This is one of the reasons I think why everyone has to have an email. They will provide an email, and the individual will be sent an email with a case number and instructions to provide documentation that they will use to verify the individual's identity. They'll submit that documentation, and then within 1 to 3 days, federal student aid will send an email confirming that their identity has been verified. So they are going to have to answer, hold on just 1 second. Okay, sorry, I knew I skipped a slide, sorry. What they are going to have to do, if they are one of those individuals that can't answer those 4 questions correctly, they'll call federal student aid, they'll get a case number, they'll be sent an email, and then this is what they're going to have to provide in order to verify their identity. They will have to complete a form of attestation, and that will be available on studentaid.gov, and my understanding is the link will actually be included in the email as well. And then they're going to have to provide proof of identity. If they have a valid, and it was clarified, it does have to be valid, driver's license, city or state identification card, or foreign passport, then they only have to provide 1 form of ID. If they are not able to provide a valid form, a valid piece of ID that fits into those categories, then they will have to provide a utility bill and then 1 of the following forms of ID: a municipal ID card, a community ID, or a consular identification card. Okay. We all know there are going to be some people who this will work fine, and then there are going to be other individuals for whom they still might not be able to get through this process. And I'll just anticipate the question. We don't know. I don't know. They might know. I don't know what happens if they can't. Okay. So this is what we know today. And I want to share just a little bit more about it, but I'm sure we're going to learn more in the coming days and weeks ahead. If they're not able to answer those knowledge-based questions, the process will be very similar to people who currently have an FSA ID and need to recover their FSA ID. So any of you who've been doing this for a while, we've had, we try to do everything else we can, but sometimes people ultimately just have to call federal student aid. Again, the process is the same. They get connected with someone, they provide their, they verify the information that that FSA has, they get sent an email, they have to upload documents, and I've not heard clarification on exactly how that piece is going to happen. And then they verify their identity, and then they get an email saying that they can reset their password and their FSA ID is ready to go. So it sounds like it's a very similar process. Good news that federal student aid has said that when customer service support is needed for this situation, that it will be available in multiple languages. The details will be on the website, are going to be added to the website. So I think on that page that we saw a screenshot for, there will be a little bit more information either there or somewhere else, so that individuals, us, first of all, who are trying to support these families, or the families themselves, will be able to see what they need to do in order to get connected with someone who speaks their language, because we all know we can't speak on their behalf. We've all been kind of gotten in trouble with federal student aid when we try to answer questions on behalf of someone who doesn't, understand or speak English very well. So this is going to be very helpful that there are multiple languages, not just Spanish. That's what we're understanding. So more details to come on that. Again, federal student aid held a webinar on this on November 2nd. And that can be found in the Federal Student Aid Training Center. So as are all of their webinars since that they've been doing all summer long. So you just go to fsatraining.ed.gov and you can access that. You do have to set up an account in order to access all of those trainings. But, if you haven't already, it's really a great idea because I do think that they will continue to provide training, and it will be helpful just to be able to go directly to the source and see what they had to say. Okay. Well, if you guys are up for it, let's do a Kahoot. I'm checking my time here. Yes, okay. Let's do a Kahoot because I think this is a helpful way of learning and just kind of keeping it fresh, not having people fall asleep on me. Okay, so let me share my screen. Get there. All right. Let me start Kahoot. And so any of you who have played Kahoot before, you are going to go to, it's going to show it up here, kahoot.it. And then a pin is going to come up. So you hold on just a second. It's loading, as you can see. Okay. One moment. Well, okay. So you're going to go to www.kahoot.it. And then it's going to ask you for a pin. And then you're going to put in this pin. Okay, so we're starting to have people join. So this is great. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but I'd love to have you do it because I do think it's fun. We're going to have 8 questions. Okay, we have a bunch of people. We don't seem to have everyone on yet. So let me hold on just a second. Okay, great. I love the names sometimes that all of you pick. All right, my guess is we're pretty much there. So let's go ahead and get started. But before we do, one thing I want to say really quickly about Kahoot is you got to get it's about, winning, right? Everything's about winning. Not really, but I know people still love to win. So you won't need to get the question right in order to get points, but it also matters how quickly you answer the question. But I will say, be careful. So some of the questions, true and false, are going to have 10 seconds. Most of the other ones are going to have 20 seconds. The one at the very end has 30 seconds because I want you to read through the whole question. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Whoops, sorry about that. This is a true or false. Parents without an SSN will go to studentaid.gov to create their FSA ID. Is that true or false? All righty. That is true. So parents are going to go to studentaid.gov to create their FSA IDs just like everybody else. Studentaid.gov, up in the upper right-hand corner, is where they will click on Start or Create an Account. All right. So you can look at the scoreboard here. Okay, Sarah, you're killing it already. So let's go on to the next question. This one's a true or false again. People without an SSN can get an FSA ID now. Okay. Can people without an SSN get an FSA ID now? See, the critical point there was now. No, they cannot yet. Okay. They're going to be able to, and maybe that was kind of a trick question, but they cannot yet. So they will be able to, but not until the FAFSA rolls out. Okay, had a little bit of a change in the leaderboard here. So let's go on to the next question. Okay, how many knowledge-based questions will individuals be asked? 2, 3, 4, or 5? How many questions are people going to be asked? And this one you have a little bit longer, just because you have multiple responses to read through. All right, 4 is the correct answer. Great job, everybody. Yes, there'll be 4 questions. I know there are only 3 on the screen that I showed you, but it's going to be 4. All right, let's see what that leaderboard does. Oh, pretty stable. A little bit of movement, but not too much. Okay. How many chances will individuals have to answer the knowledge-based verification questions as we understand it today? 1, 2, 3, or 4? How many chances are they going to have as we understand it today? There's no 15-second one. There's not an in-between, so. 1, exactly. So as of right now, it is just a one-shot deal. That, could change. There has been a request that they be given at least 2, but as of today, they'll only have 1. So we just want people to be really careful and not zip right through them, but to, think about them carefully because, we've all misread questions before. So we just want people to take their time when they do that. All right, there's the leaderboard. Let's see the next question. This is our 5th question. Going through this verification process will impact their credit score. Is that true or is that false? True or false, going through this process will impact their credit score. The answer is false, 100% correct. You are all right on it. You're right. So no one needs to worry about it impacting their credit score. Nothing like that happens. Even though it's TransUnion that's actually doing this process behind the scenes. Okay. Another true and false. Individuals must have a credit history in order for there to be knowledge-based questions. Is that true or false? Do they need to have some credit history out there in order to be able to have questions presented to them? Correct. The answer is false. So, I think even Federal Student Aid and NCAN have admitted that they are going to see how well this process works and whether they really do have questions on everybody. But that's what we're being told. So we'll see how it goes. All right, little bit of movement. Here's our 7th question. If a parent doesn't answer the knowledge-based questions correctly, they will need to call Federal Student Aid. And that will be their only option, is to call Federal Student Aid. Is that true or is that false? Killing it, guys. Yes, that is true. As we understand it right now, that is the only option, is they will have to call Federal Student Aid, but thankfully we'll have customer service available in multiple languages. All right. So this last question, you have 30 seconds on, because I want you to read through all of them, because this one is a little bit, the answers are longer. Okay. This is the last one, everybody. When will an FSA ID be available for use specifically for those without a social security number? So when will an FSA ID be available for use specifically for those, because it's a different answer, who do not have a social security number? All right. Immediately, if the 4 knowledge-based questions are answered correctly. Okay, so that's the good news. If they answer those questions correctly, then that's great, and they can use their FSA ID immediately. So once their information is verified with the Social Security Administration, that is not correct for these individuals because they don't have an SSN. So for everybody who does, you are correct that their information will need to be verified with SSA first, which is why we want them to get their FSA ID early. But for those who do not have a Social Security number, if they answer those 4 knowledge-based questions correctly, they can use their FSA ID immediately. If they can't answer them correctly, they will have to call Federal Student Aid, but it won't be available until they provide the documentation that's required. So it'll take a little bit and depend on how quickly that all happens. And then I think I just threw in 7 days there just to have 4 choices. Okay, so I hope that was a good way to chat more about this. Let's see who our winner is. All righty. Good job, everybody. Who is the winner? SK. All right. I'm not sure. There are some SKs in my life, and I think I know who that is. And if it is, regardless if it is or isn't, congratulations, SK. That was great. So let's do this now. And thank you again. And I just love this. I just think this is a fun way of talking about information that can be pretty darn dry. So let's go back now. I'm just transitioning back over to get my right screen. There we go. Okay, you're all with me. Let me turn off Kahoot in the background because it is still playing music. Okay, all right. So now, hopefully you're all seeing my screen, okay? If someone's not seeing something that says FAFSA process changes, then send me a quick chat and let me know that. Otherwise, I'm good. Okay, so it's 1:52. So here's what I'm thinking. I think what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some process changes, and then we're going to save some formula changes. We'll talk about those in December. So hopefully you will plan on joining us in November as well. Okay, so some of this we've talked a little bit about, but I wanted to share it in a little bit more detail than we've talked about it in most of our sessions. So the 24-25 FAFSA is going to be a roles-based form. So the student will log in and see only student information. They'll see the questions, demographic questions, their high school. That's where the colleges will be listed. They will provide consent and approval themselves, and they will answer, any other questions that are required. The parents will log in and they will only see parent-related questions. So like the parents will just see, basically demographic and income and assets potentially. Okay, so that's all they will see are questions that relate to them. But whoever starts the FAFSA, either the student or parent they will invite the other party to complete their section of the FAFSA. So I wanted you to see this screenshot that's been released by Federal Student Aid. So what you can see is that when I sign in, or when I go to Federal Student Aid, again, this is not available yet, but when we go to Federal Student Aid and do the FAFSA, the first thing we are going to do, or an individual is going to do, is to identify who they are. Are they the student or are they the parent? And either one can start the FAFSA. So that's the good news. Either one can start the FAFSA. And, I think there are going to be situations where we are going to recommend that the student start it. And there's going to be situations where it's probably going to make a lot more sense for the parent to start it. And here is why. If the student starts the FAFSA and is dependent, then they are going to need to invite their parent to complete the FAFSA, okay? When inviting the parent, the student must, this is again, black and white must, provide the parent's legal name, date of birth, or social security number, unless the parent doesn't have one. So I'll come back to that in just a second, okay? So again, if the student starts the FAFSA, they can invite their parent. We've identified who their contributing parent would be, who needs to be on the FAFSA, and they will invite them. The challenge, of course, is that many students, my kids don't know my social security number, and some parents might not be comfortable giving their students their social security number. So in that situation, what we might recommend is that the parent start the FAFSA. And if the parent starts the FAFSA, then they will do their section, and then they can invite the student, same thing, providing the student's name, social security, and date of birth, an email address, and then the student can do that. Now, one thing I think that makes me feel better about this process is that the invitation is sent and the student or parent can act on it instantaneously. So you can have, as I understand it, a family sitting around a table. And so let's just say that the student starts the FAFSA because the parent's okay with giving them their social. They'll get to that section where they invite the parent. The parent will be sent an email and they will get that immediately. And so they will be able to go in and start their section. So I've been talking, as we've been thinking about events in January, of locations where we can actually maybe have two computers, right? And so we have the student and parent sitting beside each other, because once one starts and invites the other can then be working on their section. So just food for thought as you're thinking about events or different scenarios as to how we're going to do that how do we want that setup to be? Now, just briefly, what I want to say is related to the same thing as when creating an FSA ID. When inviting someone, if the student, because again, students all have to have SSNs, again, unless they're freely associated, but in the case where students starts the FAFSA and their parent does not have an SSN, I want you to see here, because again, this is not live yet, there's that box that says my parent doesn't have an SSN. Okay, so remember, gone are the days where you'd put in zeros for parents if they didn't have an SSN. Instead, now they will indicate that they don't have a social security number. And what that will update to show, we're not seeing it here, but it will update to ask them for that mailing address, because again, that mailing address is going to be critical for people who don't have an SSN, because address is one of the items that potentially is going to verify their identity. Okay. So I have a question, but hold tight for just a second. Let me say these things, and then I'll look at the question. So I do think it's really important for students and families to discuss who will start the FAFSA, or at least have a conversation about the fact that when the FAFSA is done, that they're going to have to provide us a social security number for the other party. And just plan for that, because that's very different than how it's been in the past. This invitation piece is what gets those two sections connected. So if you've got the student section and the parent section, those have to match up. This invitation process is what does that. So therefore, that invitation process, it's critical that the information is correct. So the name, social security number, and date of birth have to be whatever is in the FSA ID. So again, if I'm a student and I'm inviting my parent, when I provide their name, social security number, and date of birth, it's the same information that they would have used to create their FSA ID. And because it's being verified with the Social Security Administration, that information had to be what was on their Social Security card. So for people who go by nicknames or a totally different name, when they create their FSA ID, it's got to be what's on file with the Social Security Administration. And when people invite contributors, they've got to use that same information that was used to create the FSA ID, with the exception of the email address. The email address can be a different address. It does not have to be the same address that is in the FSA ID. So for example, if I were to have my kids send me something, in my FSA ID, it's my personal address. But if I want to get an email from my kids, to be honest with you, they know to email me at work with my FAME address. Okay. The other thing I just wanted to add is that two-step verification is going to be required anytime people log in. So in the past, like it was rolled out over the course of the last year, but prior to last year, for example, every time you logged in, you didn't need to, go through the verification, that two-factor verification process. That will be required every time. So that means when a student logs in, they're going to get that text and, have to provide that code or that email and get that code. And they're going to have to enter that into the system if they want to proceed. Same thing every time a parent logs in. So this is going to require some coordination. I noticed, because Noah my youngest did do a FAFSA this year. I was just doing it for him, to be honest with you. I couldn't do it for him. I had to wait till he got home, because at work I couldn't reach him. And he got sent that text and I couldn't proceed without that code. So just a little more food for thought on that. That as we're working through this, we just think about, how that's going to work for families. And I think it's going to potentially create a few challenges. I do have a couple questions in the chat. Well, actually, yeah. So the question was, so what were the concerns with having one person file the FAFSA as opposed to this new style, which needs both parents to fill out information? I think so many of the changes this year are because information is coming directly from the IRS, and that information is now subject to a whole set of different privacy considerations. And it is like the most strictly held information. We know about FERPA and we know about HIPAA. federal tax information is on a whole different level. So I think that when I look at all of these different changes, the strictness with FSA IDs, the fact that they have to be authenticated by SSA ahead of time, the fact that they have to be used individually, the fact that you have to use two-factor verification every single time, I think it all goes back to that. If a family would prefer to do the FAFSA together, could we suggest the scenario where you just described and advise that they do so in the same room with 2 computers or maybe 2 laptops? Yes, exactly. I think if that scenario is possible, that's going to be great. And could you point us in the direction of the document you folks have to lay out the get ready to file the FAFSA steps? Yes, I will put that in the email follow-up. Okay. All right. Well, what I would talk about next, if we had more time, is FAFSA formula changes. But like I said, I was pretty sure I was going to run out of time today. So I'm going to jump off and go to the other webinar and hope to learn all sorts of new things as well, or confirmation of some things. So what you can look for is an email from me next week with a link to this recording and the slide deck, as well as the link to our Get Ready, and I'll throw in the FSA ID worksheets as well. So if you have any questions, email me directly. I look forward to seeing you in December. Go on our events page, famemain.com/events, if you would like to register now for December session, which will take place on Friday, December 15th at 1 o'clock. Okay, great. Have a great day, everybody.